Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gesha Village Estate, wash processed Ethiopia from Passenger Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Passenger, based out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And they're a coffee roaster that appears on this channel pretty regularly, as they're one of my favorite coffee roasters in the entire world. So when we picked up the Ermeni Gildo Marin, our March 2023 coffee of the month, it felt like a great opportunity to pick up and review something else from Passenger. And I'd actually heard a lot of positive things about this coffee. And we haven't reviewed a lot of Ethiopian Geshas on this channel. So this felt like a great opportunity to review a coffee that's had a lot of positive feedback, as well as an Ethiopian Gesha. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Passenger's recipe, which is a 15.625 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 210 degrees Fahrenheit, 99 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, this is the lightest roasted coffee we have reviewed from Passenger up to this point, as a lot of people would consider this to be a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. This one is definitely on par with some of the lightest coffees that we have reviewed on this channel. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and ran it through the V60, and the cup did immediately offer a very defined sugar cookie profile right at the forefront. The cup itself was moderately sweet with a very clean and defined bergamot citric aspect to it once it did cool down. A lot of heightened definition, as so many of the flavors were very much pronounced and at the forefront of the cup, with a lingering floral finish, leaving a very positive first impression. Even with all of those things, what I was looking for the most on this first impression was a lot of the berry aspects that are listed on this coffee. However, I didn't get a whole lot of that, so it's going to be interesting to see if maybe I was able to pull out some more of those in later days. Day 18, ran it to the Chemex, and a lot of the really light aspects of this coffee can be felt, as in general, there was just a fair bit of light profile to this one. It was extremely reminiscent of brown sugar milk tea on this day, as it had a really high brown sugar sweetness with a soft florality and a very soft citric component. A lot of the components through this brew method did yield just a lot of delicacy and softness to the cup in general. So that was a lot of the lighter aspects of this one really showing themselves. So Chemex was an interesting first impression. We continue on to day 22 as we ran it through the April dripper, and once again the cup came out almost slightly grainy as it continued to remain a very light coffee in general. It continues to focus on the brown sugar aspect, though it does open up a little as it cools. A bit more of the citric components are present once it does cool down, but definitely not the best day I'd experienced of this coffee, as once again it was just yielding so many lighter profiled results to it. Day 26, adjusted to Passenger's recipe, and I was finally able to pull out a slight bit more of the listed strawberry, as it was sweet, clean, and moderately pronounced in the cup with an overall increase of the sweetness. So up to this point, this coffee wasn't particularly sweet. It was focusing on some aspects that were maybe a little bit more soft and delicate, even at this time, not necessarily overly strong in terms of that direction, but there were still some other factors, including the citric aspect to the cup once it does cool down, a lot less of the grainy profile to it, and a little bit more of that soft florality and that sugar cookie sweetness yet again. So it continues to focus a little bit more on those side of things as opposed to maybe a very vibrant aspect to this coffee. Day 28, same adjustments through the Chemex, and while it was better than the previous Chemex day, I did settle on the V60 as being the better brew method for this coffee, as it doesn't necessarily have as much of the vibrancy as the V60 had. As it cools, there are plenty of these citric aspects yet again, as the listed bergamot and lime dominate the cup. This brew method really seemed to highlight and accentuate a lot of those citric characteristics, as opposed to the V60, which may have given a little bit more of those sugary components, even if those weren't necessarily overly pronounced either. Day 31, for better or worse, the cup has actually continued to remain pretty consistent with moderate improvements over time. It continues to focus on the florality. That's one of the things that has been pronounced and defined throughout the entirety of the time drinking this coffee. Sugar cookie-like aspect, boba tea-like sweetness, a little bit more of that herbal citric aspect once it does cool down. It's pretty much well layered, as you get a lot of these sweeter components on the front, and then on the back end you're experiencing a lot of those citric aspects to the cup. Just pretty soft in general, even on this day, even with the same adjustments, even with the V60. Day 34, same adjustments, and I was still struggling to get a lot of the earlier experienced factors, and that one day that I did list the strawberry aspect at day 26 mark, a little hard to replicate that once again, but even then when I was experiencing it, it wasn't an overly pronounced or dominant aspect to the coffee. If anything, it was definitely one of the more subtle components to the cup, which in general was already a pretty light and delicate coffee to begin with. Continues to remain pretty light with an increase in the citric components upon the cooldown. Still struggling to get many, if any, of the berry aspects, as it's far more pronounced in terms of the citric direction as well as the floral direction. Those things I've continued to mention, a lot of this kind of sugary sweetness, even a little bit more toned down of this sugary sweetness, that was definitely dominating the cup for me. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 5s. So let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 5. And yes, this one being a Gesha, I wasn't entirely sure at times if it would reach that level 5 mark. I still think it's on the slightly lower side of the level 5 because at times I was able to pick up a slight grainy component. There wasn't a ton of definition when some adjustments were made, and especially through the Chemex, which didn't have quite as clean and defined of a profile as the V60, though the cup in general was quite clean. It still barely reached that level 5 mark, but even then it was clean enough to justify it, as it's significantly cleaner than a lot of coffees, a lot of washed coffees in general. So credit there where it's due. It did reach that level 5 mark. I think that that part's justified. Florality, level 5. Yes, that's another one where I said from the start, I didn't think that there was a need to focus on the floral aspect to this coffee because it was one of those things where it was such a delicate coffee to begin with that the things that were pronounced, they really did seem to kind of dominate that. And I'd kind of mentioned early in this coffee that that was the florality to it, and throughout the entire time drinking it, the floral aspect was one of the things on the forefront of this one. Right there with the citric components, those were the 2 most defining factors for me. That bergamot that they do have listed, yes, I could see that. There's also a little bit of lemon. There are a number of citric components to this one as well. The florality, very much that kind of soft white flower component to it. So those 2 things, very strong, at least relative to what this coffee was, which was a very clean and delicate coffee to begin with. And then a couple of level 4s, the finish level 4. Interestingly, I think a lot of that does come from the citric aspect to this coffee, because maybe if the citrus wasn't quite as pronounced as it was, then it might not reach all the way up there at that level 4. But it was that slightly herbal citric component to it, which makes perfect sense given that bergamot is one of the notes that they have listed on here. I just remembered that wafer cookie is one of the other things, which makes a lot of sense that there was a lot of sugar cookie in it and a lot of florality in it as well. So those are kind of the finishing aspects within this one. Acidity level 4, yes, there was still a fair bit of brightness to it. I kind of played around with the idea of maybe keeping it at a level 3, but I think at the end of the day, the citrus did kind of justify enough brightness to push that up to the level 4. So yeah, that feels apt for me. And then the thing that's probably most worth discussing on this tasting wheel is the sweetness at a level 3. That's the big sticking point for me on this coffee. I couldn't get more sweetness from it. Even though the dominant profile in this one for me at times was the sugary aspect to it, that kind of bubble tea sugariness, that kind of cookie sweetness to it, it was still more moderate. And at no point, even with adjustments, could I really pull out a lot more of the sweetness to this one. I don't think that this coffee was intended to be an overly sweet coffee. I think that what I was experiencing from this coffee is what it was intended to be. A little bit more soft and delicate, complex, and pull out a lot of those components to it. But I think what really frustrated me was not being able to get more of the berry, as I feel like that berry fruit at that level 3 might be a little generous. But it's because it was a little bit more pronounced than a lot of the other things that reached those level 2 marks, the spice, the salty. So it's the lower side of the level 3, but it was present in this coffee, just maybe not quite as defined and pronounced as I was hoping for. Last thing worth discussing is the body at level 1. It's a light-bodied cup of coffee, light-profiled cup of coffee. That's something I've been alluding to right since the start. So I don't think that there's too much else worth saying in this tasting wheel. I think that this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Obviously, the first place I'm going to go to is the sweetness being at level 3. I always say that we start the discussion for me really enjoying a coffee by getting the sweetness to that level 4 mark. And for whatever reason, this one seems to lack the sort of sweetness that I was looking for in it. I feel like they've had this coffee for a while, so maybe it's just on the slightly older side of things and it's not quite as good as when it was first received. That could be the case, but for whatever reason, not being able to get more vibrancy in that sense, and the listed strawberry that they have on here, I fully expected that to be one of the most defined and dominant characteristics to it, and it was the thing I was seeking to get the most from this coffee, and I really struggled to get that. But I've said in the past that sometimes I do struggle with Passenger's coffees ever so slightly, as they can be, in this case, very light, and that makes it a little bit more tricky to get right. So I feel like that's the case with this one. I feel like this one's on me, even though I do kind of feel that this is the direction that this coffee was intended to go. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, first and foremost, definitely your lighter profiled coffees and definitely your more delicate and subtle coffees, as even with the level 5s that are on here, they're a little bit more subtle in manner, but that's because this coffee had such a clean base to it that whatever was really strong and defined, it was quite well pronounced. So that's the case with this one right here, and that's a good starting point for this one. Focus, of course, going to be on the florality and the citric aspects to it, and the added sweetness that did come from this kind of sugar cookie aspect, this kind of bubble tea aspect. I think that was my favorite part of this coffee, and I think it did play in well and complement the other things that were present within this one, most distinctly thinking, of course, of that citric component that was present here. But I think for the most part, this is kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Gesha Village wash processed Ethiopia from Passenger Coffee. Thank you for watching.